We begin in the Oreburgh gym, with Paul about to face Byron for the second time. The gym leader opens with Bronzor as per usual, while Paul chooses to start the match with Chimchar. In the stands, Maylene is surprised by this, saying that she thought Paul started with Turtwig. Ash explains that he did, briefly recounting how Paul found Chimchar in Viridian Forest. Meanwhile, Paul wastes no time, calling for a flame wheel, which hits Bronzor and sends it skidding back. However, it doesn't seem as damaged as it should be, which irritates Paul and causes him to snap at Chimchar about using its true power. But Byron says it's not Chimchar's fault, since his Bronzor has the ability Heatproof, meaning it takes less damage from fire-type moves. Paul scowls, but surmises that this means it is susceptible to ground-type moves, and so calls for a dig. Chimchar burrows underground, and Byron commends Paul's deductive reasoning, allowing Chimchar to burst forth from the ground and slam into Bronzor. He then calls for payback, but Paul has seen this trick before, and orders Chimchar to use Flame Wheel to keep from being knocked back. The force of Flame Wheel and Payback collide, with it being initially unclear who will prevail. However, this doubt is soon cast from everyone's mind, when Chimchar breaks through the opposition and slams into Bronzor. Before Byron can call his next attack, Paul has already called his, having Chimchar use Flame Wheel once again, to send Bronzor crashing down into Chimchar's hole. He then finishes up with another dig, that sends Chimchar in after Bronzor, until the little steel type comes shooting out the other side, unconscious. Byron brings out his Bastiodon next, and though Paul wants to see if he can push Chimchar further, he decides to call it back in favour of his Geodude. Once more, Paul takes the offensive, ordering a Rock Smash. Byron sighs that perhaps Paul hasn't learned as much from their last match as he'd hoped, and calls for a Flash Cannon. Just when it seems that history is going to repeat, Paul pulls out a surprise tactic, ordering Geodude to drop and roll. The rock type obeys, and rolls between Bastiodon's front legs, lodging itself under its stomach. Paul then has it use a volley of rock smashes, which clearly cause pain to Bastiodon, made evident by the way it tries in vain to dislodge Geodude. When this doesn't work, Byron tells Paul that it's about time he used that creative thinking that the twins are so good at, then has Bastiodon fire a flash cannon at the ground. Quickly, the ground which was already weakened by Chimchar's dig begins to crack, until finally it gives way, creating a pit in front of Bastiodon. The large steel type begins to fall in, but is able to plant its back legs on the edge and briefly hold its footing. Geodude, on the other hand, is not so lucky, and comes rolling out before it can find purchase anywhere. Paul yells at it to start floating, but this is exactly what Byron wanted them to do, and so as Geodude rises up, it comes right into Flash Cannon range. It has no chance of escape, and Bastiodon lets one loose at point blank. Geodude spirals through the air, before crashing to the earth at Paul's feet, with Rock's declaration that it's unable to battle being little more than a formality. Calling Geodude pathetic, Paul withdraws it and brings out his Fearow. Byron praises that Paul has caught himself a whole host of new friends since their last battle, but Paul has no time for chatting and just orders a drill run. Fearow's speed is nothing short of phenomenal, as it soars at Bastiodon and smashes its beak into the steel type's plated face. The pair clash, and then come apart, now with mutual respect in their eyes. Byron then calls for another flash cannon, while Paul tells his Pokemon to use Draw Run again. However, this time Byron has no intention of making this easy for Paul. Even though Fearow is able to dodge the original flash cannon, Byron keeps having Bastiodon fire more in an attempt to keep Fearow at a distance. This strategy works for a while, but Paul refuses to get flustered. Instead, he weighs his options and comes to the most practical conclusion. When the next flash cannon comes, Paul tells Fearow to fly in rather than dodging. The flying type squawks its disagreement, but Paul snaps to do as he says, and Fearow complies. Clenching its jaw, it dives into the beam and charges for Bastiodon. Byron asks if he's trying to repeat Stantler's trick from their first match, but Paul says no, he just needed a way to get in close before doing this. He then orders Fearow to burst out of the flash cannon and circle around to the back of Bastiodon's head. Fearow at last understands its trainer's thinking process, and so shoots out of the flash cannon and does a tight aerial arc to come out behind Bastiodon. Because Paul allowed Fearow to take the hit to get in close, Bastiodon doesn't have enough reaction time, and so its head comes crashing forward when Fearow's beak slams into the unprotected back half. There is stillness for a moment, then Bastiodon keels over, and Rock says it's unable to battle. Byron commends Paul, but says he knows what's up next. Paul says he does, and subs out Fearow for Chimchar, while Byron brings out Steelix. At once, Paul calls for a Flame Wheel, while Byron has Steelix use Iron Tail. The attacks collide, but this time Chimchar is pushed back. Barely even getting a chance to get back to its feet, Paul tells it to do that again, and Chimchar obeys, though the results are the same. Paul calls for a third flame wheel, but now Ash has had enough, and tells Paul that his plan isn't working, and all that he's accomplishing is hurting Chimchar. Paul orders his brother to butt out, saying this is his battle, not Ash's, even as Chimchar is slammed into the dirt for the third time. For a moment, Chimchar doesn't stir, and so Rock prepares to call the match in Steelix's favour, but Paul demands he stop and look at Chimchar's tail. All in attendance turn their attention to the small fire type's tail flame, which to their surprise is steadily growing. Ash and Paul know what this is, but it comes as a shock to everyone else when Chimchar rises with murderous red eyes. Paul now tells Chimchar to use Flame Wheel again, but instead the fire type shrieks and uses Dig. Everyone wonders what is happening until it emerges behind Steelix and launches a barrage of fireball-sized embers. These get the Steel type's attention, but when it turns to face its opponent, Chimchar finally uses Flame Wheel. At once, it is clear that this Flame Wheel is twice the size of Chimchar's previous ones, and when Steelix tries to counter it with Iron Tail, it breaks through with ease. Chimchar then slams into Steelix's forehead, before coming out of its Flame Wheel and using Scratch. This does next to nothing, and so it scampers over and fires a point-blank ember into Steelix's eye. Steelix writhes and screams, causing Byron to demand that Paul get his Berserk Pokemon under control. Paul shoots back a blithe smile, and asks why should he when he's winning. Byron calls this callousness disappointing, and orders Steelix to shake Chimchar off. Steelix does as it's told, but Chimchar is not ready to stop fighting yet. As it falls, Chimchar spots Bastiodon's crater from earlier, and uses another Flame Wheel, turning the crater into a half-pipe. This allows it to shoot back up and slam into Steelix's chin. The force of this attack is such that Steelix's entire body is briefly lifted into the air, before crashing back down and creating a massive dust cloud. When it settles, Steelix is unable to battle, and Paul is named the winner. Chimchar, however, is not finished raging, and so Paul has to call it back into its ball before it can attack Byron or Rock. Byron then presents Paul with his own mind badge, but there is no praise or laughter to be had here. Instead, Byron soberly asks Paul to reconsider his battling style. Allowing his Pokemon to get injured in order to get easy wins isn't the mark of true strength, and though he lost last time, Byron had far more respect for him then than he does now. Paul just scowls and scoops up his badge. He then approaches Rock and asks if he still wants to be a Pokemon trainer someday. Rock says that he does, and so Paul drops Geodude's Pokeball in his hand. He says that he has no use for a Pokemon that fell twice, and so Rock can keep it or release it. He doesn't care. He then calls to Ash that they're leaving, but it is Maylene who approaches him. She calls his battle style despicable, and says he has no right to be raising Pokemon. If he's gonna let them injure themselves for him, then toss them aside if they don't meet his standards. Paul coldly asks what she knows anyway, but she says more than him if he doesn't even know how to treat his partners. At this point, Paul is sick of everyone criticizing his methods, and so tells Maylene to meet him at the Pokemon Center tonight, and they will settle this. Maylene agrees, and the pair part ways, with Ash rejoining his brother. That evening, Maylene and Paul meet at the battlefield behind the Pokemon Center. They decide that it will be a one-on-one match, with Ash refereeing. Since Paul proposed the battle, he gets to choose first and brings out his Chimchar, while Maylene does the same. The nearly identical simian Pokemon appraise each other briefly, then Ash calls for the battle to begin. Keeping up his strategy with Byron, Paul takes the offensive and orders a dig. While Maylene's Chimchar tries to strike with embers, his burrows into the ground and comes back up with an uppercut that sends its counterpart stumbling back. But Maylene is not one to give up, and so encourages her partner to get back out there with a power-up punch. Her Chimchar chitters its agreement and slugs Paul's in the face. Paul's Chimchar howls, but its trainer tells it to shake it off and use dig again. Paul's Chimchar once more burrows underground, but this time when it comes up to punch Maylene's Chimchar meets it with a power punch of its own. The two strike each other in the face, and are sent skidding in opposite directions. By this point, both Chimchar are breathing heavily, though Maylene's certainly looks worse for wear. So Paul tells his one to wrap this up with a flame wheel. Paul's Chimchar immerses itself in flame and rolls towards Maylene's, but to Ash and Paul's shock, Maylene's Chimchar catches the flame wheel. Paul demands his Pokemon keep going and break through, while Maylene's encourages hers to stay strong. It appears this will be a stalemate, until Maylene's Chimchar starts to evolve. Granted extra power now that it is a Monferno, Maylene's Pokemon punches Chimchar hard enough that it knocks it out of its flame wheel. Monferno then steps forward to finish its pre-evolution off, but Paul has a plan. Without hesitation, he yells for Chimchar to jump between Monferno's legs and grab its tail. Chimchar deftly does this, and then Paul orders a final dig. For the third time, Chimchar burrows down, but this time it drags a very worried Monferno with it. From within the hole, everyone can hear Monferno's pained hollering as it bangs into the tunnel walls and various rocks. When Chimchar finally breaches the surface, it wastes no time in throwing Monferno into the air. Paul then calls for an Ember, which strikes Monferno in midair and knocks it out. Chimchar begins to do a celebratory dance, but Paul scolds it, saying the defeat of pathetic trainers and their weak Pokemon is nothing to celebrate over, then orders it returned to him. Meanwhile, Maylene is bent over her Monferno, telling it did well, and seeing that it is okay. When she hears Paul talk to Chimchar this way, she looks at the smaller fire type and asks if it really wants to follow a jerk like him. She then extends a hand, offering it to come with her instead, but Chimchar looks back to Paul, then scampers over to stand beside him. Paul smugly asks Maylene if she's still convinced that his style is wrong, when even evolution couldn't grant her victory over his Chimchar. But Maylene just snaps that brute strength may have won this round, but they will meet again, and her warrior spirit will prevail in the end. Paul tells her that he doesn't have time for this, and recalls Chimchar and begins walking away from the Pokemon Center. Ash chases after Paul, asking why he hasn't gone back inside to get Chimchar healed. Paul replies that its injuries aren't that bad, and they need to get moving if they want to reach the next gym as quick as possible. Ash says that's no excuse for not looking after his Pokemon, and that they should stay in the Pokemon Center and head out first thing tomorrow. Paul scoffs that right there is the difference between the two of them. Ash talks about wanting to be the best, while Paul actually does what it takes, and right now that means making haste, not slowing down to nurse a few boo-boos. Ash asks what happened to Paul. He's always been strict, but lately he's become cruel. Paul's scowl deepens, and he tells Ash that seeing Reggie and Brandon's battle really opened his eyes. Before that, Reggie was his yardstick for strength, but now he's realized that Reggie was just playing around, and that's why he came up short. If he wants to be the best, he and his Pokemon have to keep focused and stop at nothing to achieve their goals. He then adds that Ash has the potential to be just as strong. He just needs the right mindset, and offers Ash his hand. Ash weighs this, but ultimately refuses, saying he still wants to be the best, but he's not going to start acting like Paul to get there. Paul raises his eyebrows, and Ash continues that he still believes in the way Reggie taught them, and that he's going to remind Paul of the value of friendship if it's the last thing he does. Paul seems more disappointed than angry at this challenge, and tells Ash so be it. In time the results will speak for themselves. But he does warn his twin that if he tries to get in his way, he will take him down just like any other obstacle. Ash heartily replies that Paul can try, but he and his Pokemon won't go down without a fight. Paul just nods at this, then turns and starts back towards Oreburgh Gate. Even though night has fallen, Ash and Paul decide to push through the cave, and are greeted by the sight of several nocturnal Pokemon. Ash considers adding a Zubat to his team, but chooses to hold off for now, since one failed capture attempt could bring the whole swarm down on them in the dark. The twins then make camp on Route 203, with Ash choosing to turn in early, while Paul and his Pokemon go off to train for a few more hours. This pattern continues for the next few nights, as Ash and Paul make their way past Jubilife City and up towards Floroma Town, until one night, Ash decides to sit in on Paul's training. For the most part it is fairly standard, with Paul having his Pokemon battle each other, albeit at full force, rather than a leisurely sparring pace. But when it comes Chimchar's turn to fight, things take a turn for the worse. Paul has it face Fearow, who he commands to use Drill Run repeatedly, while telling Chimchar to endure the hits. When Ash demands to know why Paul isn't having Chimchar fight back, he reveals that he's been trying to replicate the situation in Viridian Forest, where he caught Chimchar, so they can work on mastering Blaze. Ash protests that they already used Blaze against Byron, but Paul sighs that though Chimchar's Blaze activated, it went berserk and wouldn't listen to a thing Paul said. But if they could get that power under control, no one would be able to stand up to them. Ash asks how Chimchar feels about this, saying it can't be easy to relive such a traumatic memory night after night. But Paul snaps that his Pokemon aren't with him because they want easy, they're with him because they want to be the best. He then rounds on Chimchar, and asks, "Isn't that right?" A battered Chimchar nods its head, and Paul says to get back to work. He then tells Ash that he can watch, but only if he keeps his mouth shut. But Ash says he doesn't want to anymore, and that he's going to go train with his own Pokemon, but he'll do it the right way without hurting them. Paul says whatever, then turns back to his Pokemon, ordering Turtwig and Stantler to attack Chimchar as well. After this, instead of going to bed early, each night when Paul goes off to train his Pokemon this way, Ash finds a separate clearing and trains with his own. However, his methods are vastly different, and though the Pokemon still spar, there is plenty of laughter and encouragement, so that when they do go to sleep, it is with feelings of pride in their hard work and the bonds they have forged. Eventually, Floroma Town comes into sight, and for once it is Paul who suggests stopping. Ash happily accepts but asks why. Paul tells him that he wants to stock up on netballs, since they're going to pass through Eterna Forest next, where it would be prudent to pick up a bug type before facing what he's heard is a grass type gym. Ash agrees that this is good thinking, and so while their Pokemon are being treated by Nurse Joy, the boys go and purchase some netballs. After this, it barely takes Ash and Paul any time to get to Eterna Forest, but when they arrive, they find the forest entrance blocked off by a Pokemon Ranger. She tells the boys that recently a marauding Scyther has taken up residence in the forest, and now terrorizes people and Pokemon alike. Ash says this is terrible, and volunteers to help, while Paul goes along for slightly different reasons. The Ranger accepts their offer, and so the trio head into the forest together. From there, the Scyther's path of destruction is easy to follow, and leads them to a combi hive, where Scyther is gorging itself on honey, while the combi watch on in terror. The Ranger tells the boys to stand back, and that she will use her stylus to bring Scyther around to their side, but Paul scoffs not to bother, and sends in his Stantler. Hearing Stantler's bellows, Scyther turns to face it just in time to be hit with hypnosis. When it falls asleep without resistance, Paul calls it an idiot, but nonetheless catches it with a netball, while Ash and their Ranger companion watch. However, she is not happy about this, saying Paul used her to find Scyther. Paul retorts that he solved her problem, and so this encounter was mutually beneficial, and to leave it at that. Ash apologizes for his brother's rudeness, and then the duo head further into the forest. That night, while training, Ash and his Pokemon feel eyes watching them from within the trees. Unafraid, Ash calls out to ask who's there, and a Steely flutters down to land in front of him. Ash recognizes this Steely at once as the one that Paul abandoned, and asks if it followed them all the way back here from Kanto. Steely morosely nods its head, with Ash only now seeing how exhausted it is. Bending down, Ash strokes its feathers, complimenting Steely on its loyalty and strength of will, but the flying type still seems depressed. Occasionally it gives longing looks in the direction where Chimchar's embers can be seen lighting up the night from a distance, and Ash guesses it still misses Paul. Ash offers to facilitate a rapprochement, and Steely gives a hopeful chirp, flapping up onto Ash's shoulder. He then heads to Paul's clearing, telling him there's someone who wants to see him. Paul looks around curiously, but upon seeing Steely scowls that he already told it to get lost in Kanto, and demands to know why it wasted its time, and now his, by following him when he wants nothing to do with it. Steely looks devastated, and Ash snaps that's no way to talk to a friend, but Paul tells him that loser Pokemon is no friend of his. Steely now looks like it might die of heartbreak, but Ash cuts in, saying that Steely is his friend. Paul then suggests if that's the case, why doesn't he catch it, calling them loser birds of a feather. Ash says he will, and offers Steely a place on his team, with Steely gratefully accepting. Ash then adds it to his roster while Paul mutters that he's pathetic if he wants that cast-off on his team. The brothers then return to their respective training, and there is tension between them all the next day until they reach Eterna City. It is evening when they arrive in Eterna City, so Ash and Paul don't bother going to the gym, instead checking in at the Pokemon Center. But as they hand their Pokemon over to Nurse Joy for healing, they hear an excited squeal, and a woman with ginger hair, dressed all in green and orange, rushes over to them. At once she fawns over Paul's Turtwig, asking if he's here to challenge the gym. He says that he is, and she demands that he come challenge her first thing in the morning, introducing us off as Gardenia, the gym leader. Paul agrees, though Ash sulks that Paul had 2 gym battles in a row and it should be his turn now. Gardenia laughs at this, saying she will face him too, and bids the boys goodnight and says she will see them in the morning. And that's where we'll leave things, with Ash and Paul on the cusp of their second gym battle. How will Ash's strategy of kindness measure up to Paul's ruthlessness? Can either of them beat Gardenia on the first try? And what's the deal with her going nuts over Paul's Turtwig? Find out next time when the journey continues.